a problem because we're not showing the video.
No, we're
Oh,
not. I did turn on the recording though, so whenever Bob wants to cut it, and we'll do the
okay.
intro however you want to do it.
Yeah, we'll definitely have him do that. And so, yeah, thanks a lot, for joining us today. That's a terrible. Let's start again. Now you got me thinking about the recording. Oh no, it's
Yeah,
sort of
pressure, Mary, huge
natural.
pressure. Ah,
um, so we're here today to do our new podcast, Creative Conversations. My name is Mary, and our first guest is a very wonderful author named Pat Wahler, and she's written a lot of awesome books. I have a favorite that I read called "I Am Mrs. Jesse James," but she's written a lot of different uh, types of books, which I find really interesting. And Pat, I wanted to ask you. Well, first of all, thanks for joining us today. It's really an honor to have you.
Well, I'm
And
delighted to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I wanted to ask you when did you know that you wanted to be a writer?
Oh, I've always, I think for me, as well as probably for a lot of writers, you start out as an avid reader. You read everything you can get your hands on, and that was me. I was the kid in the summer months whose mother always said, "Get your nose out of a book and go outside," or who would go to the library and check out a big tall stack of books and read them through the week, and then the next week you go back and get more. I think that it starts there. If you love to read, I think it would surprise me if most people who are avid readers don't at some point think, gosh, it would be really cool to write a book. But no, I can't do that. That's what happens with most. They just, I can't do that.
Right.
But I think for the fact is they can if they decide to try it.
That's cool. Yeah, that's a good attitude. That you would want to invite people to be writers too, because I mean, I know there are so many people who do want to be writers or consider themselves aspiring writers, and maybe don't have the training to pull that off so well. But we could all write, in our own
Mhm,
way, poetry.
mhm,
I think a lot of new writers get kind of intimidated. They read great works and they're like, I can't write like that. And
mhm,
and I tell writers when they say things like that, I'm like, yeah, but only you can tell your story.
mhm,
Every story that can be told has been told, but it can't be told the way you would
mhm,
tell it.
mhm,
And it's just reassuring people that their voice is unique and important.
mhm.
I think is so important.
Yeah, and
And
I
I
was
think, I'm sorry.
going to say that was the voice of our publisher, Lisa Miller. She's part of the conversation today, and we're happy to have Lisa too. What were you going to say, Pat?
Well, I think one of the best things somebody who's interested or even wants to give a shot at writing something is maybe don't look at a book first. Maybe look at smaller pieces that you can write, poetry, if that's what you enjoy doing, or creative essays. Creative essays is kind of how I started. I've
Right.
got, yeah.
Do that.
So
How do
I've
you?
had like 19 stories with Chicken Soup for the Soul, and that's a really good way to get your feet wet and think, hey, you know what? I can write something that other people enjoy reading, and then that leads you on to maybe trying some.
Yeah, I wondered if that was how well, that's the natural progression. I figure for you is I noticed that you had some short stories and some a lot of the Chicken Soup for the Soul, but also didn't you have some for some magazines and
Yeah, I've had a few pieces in Sassy Magazine, which is a lovely publication. Kind of what they look for is kind of similar to what Chicken Soup for the Soul looks for in terms of it has to be a true event that happened in your life. You have to tell it in first person. Um, but it's usually 1,200 words or less. So that's kind of like a little bit more, it's not as intimidating to think I don't have to write 300 pages. I only have to write 1,200 words or less. That's a lot. It's more comforting to look at doing something like that.
did you start writing like as a young kid or as a teenager? Did you start attempting writing then?
I played a little bit like many teenage girls do. I played a little bit with poetry, but it was always like, oh, and then I would say, okay, I'm going to write a story. And then as soon as I would do that, it was just like blank page and crickets. I mean, there was nothing. But I think that's because you put pressure on yourself to do it. But one of the neat things, as we were talking about before you came on, genealogy and researching your own family history and that kind of thing, that gives you stories to tell. You don't have to start with, I don't even know, what should I write about. Um, and most people are interested in things that have happened in their own lives or in their family's life, and that's a starting place, kind of a springboard into diving into doing some creative writing, and a good way to get your feet wet.
So a lot of your writing has been based on true something that happened in your life.
Yep, that was absolutely where I started. um, my very first thing that happened to me that made me think, you know what, maybe I could write something is, and it's a silly little, talk about short. If you read Reader's Digest, they have the little, you know, workplace anecdotes and everyday life anecdotes and things like that. They're usually only a couple of sentences long, 2 or 3 sentences long. I mean, really short. So I sent something to them. And don't get me wrong, I sent a lot of things to them, but they took one, um, and they published it. And I was so excited. It was the first thing that I ever had published. Was in Reader's Digest, all in a day's work. Was the column. And what they sent me was, and this is many years ago, they sent me $300 for that little few sentences, and they sent me a bumper sticker that said, "I found money, fame, and glory. Reader's Digest bought my story."
Wow,
And I
that's
had that
cool.
thing hanging on a bulletin board for the longest time.
Wow. I wondered if you put it on your car. No way. What?
Yeah.
Well, so how old were you then?
Oh
That-
gosh, that was probably 20 years ago, I would say. So
okay.
old enough, but still, thinking, oh, I would just really wish I could write something and get it published. That would be so exciting. And it was exciting, but it also gave the incentive to, I'm going to do that. I'm going to try that. And then the next thing I did was find a local writing group, and I joined it. And that was super incentive. That's probably the best incentive of all, when you're around other people who write or who want to write.
Mm-hmm. I've
And
heard those
there's
are very encouraging,
mhm,
native places.
very supportive. And plus, the particular group that I'm involved with, Saturday Writers, they bring in weekly, or not weekly, they bring in monthly speakers that do almost like a mini workshop, and then do some longer workshops in the fall. So you start to learn things, because there is a learning curve. It's not just a matter of sitting down, any more than if you were going to be in the Olympics. You don't just sit down one day and say, I'm going to be in the Olympics tomorrow. You do need to educate yourself. You need to do a lot of reading, and there are a lot of great books on craft that are very helpful. Um, and the speakers that we bring in are very helpful, and you just start slowly learning these things, and it makes it easier, because there's a structure to what you're doing. It's not just looking at a blank page and thinking, I need to get words on here, but it needs to make sense. Well, you start learning how to make it make sense.
Patty, I love that you brought up Saturday Writers, because so many writers don't know about writing groups or writing guilds.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm contacted like at least 3 or 4 times a week by writers that it's a cold query. They just write saying, "Hey, I've got this book." They say it's a book, and then I find out they only have an idea. That sometimes happens. But hey, I've got this book, and I start engaging with them over email, and they're completely unaware of how important guilds are. And for first time writers, it's huge. I mean, that's if you're not going to go to college to hone your craft, and you don't have to. You do have to do or participate in a working group, and the state and local guilds are just an absolute necessity for that. And I'm really glad you brought up Saturday Writers.
Yeah, it's a great training ground, and plus it's a great network of fellow writers, which is really important. And then on top of that, once you start learning things, then you find yourself a critique group to get involved with, and that's the second best thing you can do, because you've got often very experienced and sometimes less experienced people looking at your work and pointing out things that you didn't notice before, because your brain tells you what it wants to see on the paper. But if you've got fresh eyes looking at it, you'll find out that there are some things that you can do to make the piece even better. So that's the second, in my view, the important thing that you can do.
Well, you've had really an interesting sort of career in your writing. You've got a variety of types of works, and I'm curious if that grew out of your creative Saturday writers group. Like if you would say, hey, I always wanted to write a children's book or whatever, people would say, yeah, we'll do it, and then you kind of brainstorm people who have
Mhm.
done that, advise you, and
Well, we have different topics, and people are naturally drawn, I think, to a particular genre or a particular, like children's books or women's fiction or westerns. People are drawn to different types of writing, and it's usually, I think it's often because that's the type you enjoy reading. So if somebody hasn't a clue what to do, I think a good place to start is, well, what kind of books do you like to read? Because then
Mhm.
truth is, that's probably what you'll enjoy writing as well, is what
And
you
that's
like to read.
you. Yeah. What was your first thing that you wanted to write in terms of a novel? Because you've written several novels.
It was it was Mrs. Jesse James. I tossed that around for years, and then one year I finally did it as a NaNoWriMo project. And of course, that's always a mess once you finish it. But the good news is you do have the words on paper.
You may
National
need to explain what
Yeah,
that is.
okay. Every November, there's a huge event called National Novel Writing Month. And the goal is you can plan your novel, you can plan your characters, you can do all of those things in advance, but you don't actually start writing until the very, very beginning. Could be 1 minute after midnight when it comes to November 1st. And you can write throughout the month. And the goal is by November 30th to have written at least 50,000 words toward a novel. And it's what's really cool about it, and what I found was really helpful about it, is you don't have time to edit. You just have to put words on paper as fast as you can. I mean, it's really not an impossible goal. I think it's, I don't know, it's less than 2,000 words a day. So it's not difficult to do. It's just you have to just keep doing it. That's the thing. It's easy to get started and then to get sidetracked and it's like, I don't want to do this anymore. But anyway, what's important for me is to get the words down without trying to fix them as I go along, because that's what bogs you down.
Sure.
If you're just sitting down and writing, then what happens is the creative part of your brain is what's working, not the logical part that says, oh, I need a comma here. Oh, I didn't capitalize that word. Oh, that might be misspelled. No, you're getting your story down. And then after after you've got the story down, then you can go back and start agonizing all over all of the other things. But at least it gets your story on paper. And as somebody, I don't remember now who it was that said it, you can't fix a blank page. So get your words on paper.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I remember when my daughter was in school, they would teach writing that way, and I would be like, wow, that's so nice that they
Mhm.
don't fuss at the kids that they misspell stuff or they don't have the right,
Mhm.
because they want to encourage that creative process. But
Mhm.
that's mind blowing. That I loved that book. That was so good, and I wanted to ask you, how you wrote it, and I had no idea that it was like that, like part of a contest, basically.
Well, it's not really a contest because really you're only competing against yourself, but there is a huge, like, there's a website for National Novel Writing Month. There's a lot of support groups for it. And it is something that many, many writers participate in. And it's worth looking into for anybody who would like to write a novel. Um, it's kind of exciting, and it's a goal setting, which we tend or at least I tend not to do sometimes. Some writers are very disciplined and say, every day I'm going to write 1,000 words, or every day I'm going to write 500 words. I don't do that, which I wish I was more disciplined about it. But when I write, I try to get a lot of words down.
Yeah. When you feel the flow of the creative
Mhm.
energy.
I kind of want to jump in here because Pat, you just hit on a couple of things. I've got on my desk. I've got Stanley Fish's How to Write a Sentence, On Writing by Stephen King, and On Writing by Ernest Hemingway. And and Ernest Hemingway's book is like Ernest Hemingway himself, as he wrote, is much smaller, much shorter. And he talked about or touched on two of the things that you just brought up. It's absolutely do not edit while you're writing. He was talking about he has to put it away. He starts first with written, and then he puts it away for a while, and then we'll come back and type it out. And I'm trying to find the quote where he talks about how typing is so impersonal, but I can't find that right now while we're talking. But the other thing that he talked about, he didn't call it discipline, I don't think, but he did give some tricks of the trade. He said never. No, he didn't say it never. He said, I can't find that quote either. To paraphrase, he said basically go to bed hungry. In other words, don't stop writing when you're finished writing for the day. Stop writing when you know what's going to happen next, so that when you wake up the next morning, you've got that already, that writing cue for the next day. So it wasn't so much a discipline. I think, at least from what I'm reading in this little book of his on writing, was that he's suggesting you're writing most every day, but there's a trick to having a writing prompt for the next time that you sit down to write.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that that's a good idea, because you're not stalled when you start writing the next day, because you know what's going to happen next.
Yeah. You just jump right in.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you have a work that you're most proud of? A favorite or?
Well, they're like your children, so of course you love them all. But I would have to probably choose I Am Mrs. Jesse James, simply because it's my first novel. It's a subject that I was really interested in. It and because it was my first novel, I entered it in everything I could possibly enter it in, which is, well, anyway, I won't go there. But I entered it in everything I could possibly enter it in, and it won a lot of things. So I was very proud of it. It's like my first baby. It was, I have a plaque over here, Western Fictioneer's Best First Novel of 2018. Um, it did well, and it didn't always take a first place for sure, but it placed and was a finalist in lots of contests. So that was exciting, and it was very validating, because I felt like they liked what I did. Because I've heard that no matter how experienced and successful an author you are, whenever a new book goes out there, you're like, oh my gosh, I hope people like it. I hope people enjoy it. You're just as insecure almost as you were at the first one. So I think
Yeah.
something that happens.
Yeah, well, I have to compliment you. That's so impressive because I was never really a reader of historical fiction, but just literally just the name of that book and everything about it, the cover and the name, and I was like, I want to read that. And I loved it. It was so well. It was just really well laid out.
I
Really cool.
appreciate that. Thank you very much. I had actually, I had one of the many places I submitted it to for reviews was to In Detail magazine, which is primarily a romance magazine, but this is a love story. So I
Yeah.
thought, you know what, I'm going to send it there. And the reviewer was very kind. She gave me the highest rating she could give it. And she said, for anyone who thinks they don't like historical fiction, I promise you will like reading this, which I thought was the greatest compliment she could possibly give me.
Wow, she was right. That's amazing.
I especially like that it took another angle on Jesse James.
Yeah.
It's all about him, and his brother, right? And it's just
Mhm.
what they did.
Mhm.
And there's so many there's, I mean, so many books are from the man's point of view. But I have a sideways question to ask you. So first, I'm really grateful to have the woman's point of view presented, to take a look at Jesse James and his life and her voice. But when I talk to male writers, I ask them the same question: how do you get into a woman's head? And that leads off into some hilarious comments, But how did you get into the male character's head and present them authentically?
Mhm. Well, one thing I will say is, I know there were some folks, typically the heavy Western readers, that were like, why didn't you tell more about Jesse out doing, his robberies and all that? And I have to remind them, this is told from Z's point of view, not from Jesse's. There's plenty out there if you want to read what Jesse did blow by blow. And most of the things that he did, he didn't tell her, and he purposely didn't tell her because he didn't want her to know. Not that she didn't suspect, not that she didn't have a pretty darn good idea of what was going on, but it didn't ever come from him. So I wasn't really doing a whole lot of writing from his perspective. It was mostly 80% at least was her perspective, because he was gone all the time doing his business.
Mhm.
But I think it's just like with any character. And I know that there's a lot out there now about how, basically you have to try and figure out a way to get inside the character's head. You kind of figure out who they are. If it's a fictional character, you do your best to create who this person is. You sit and write their biographies, basically, of all the things that could possibly be related to this person that you've either created or from history. And then based on that, how would they act? You kind of use that as a way to get into their head. And I think that's true regardless of whether you're writing a different gender. And I know, as I started to say, there's a lot out there now about, do people have the right to tell? Like if I decided to write a character of a different race or something like that, then there might be those who say, why are you don't have the right to tell that story. So that's where you look at, but if it's really important to you to tell the story, then that's where you got to look at readers who can come, who are that person, and be able to read your work and look at it and decide, you've been authentic with that particular, because that's not your true experience. So there's a lot to, I think there's a lot to trying to do your best to be authentic when you're writing a person or a character who's different from what you are, because you're not that person.
All right, I have to jump in just one more time, Mary. I know this is your conversation, but okay. So Mary's an actress, Pat,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm wondering, Mary, do you do the same thing as an actress? Like, how do you get into your character's head? Is it similar or different?
Um, uh, I think it, for acting, it's funny when she was talking, it was making me think a lot about movies and writing of those, and also portrayals in movies. But for me, I mean, I don't play big giant characters. I get smaller parts, and usually they tailor them. They pick me to play somebody that would be close to what I am, or something I could. I basically would just use my imagination to play a part. I had an audition just the other day for somebody that was very like demographically similar to me, but she was like kind of an outlaw, and she had stolen a baby when she was little.
Mm.
Yeah, so that was interesting to try to get into. I didn't find it too hard because, like I said, I could just make a leap of the imagination. I don't know anyone like that, but that is so interesting that I didn't know that. Right, I mean, I guess it makes sense. A lot of writers, like, if a novel about the Black experience is going to be tend to be written by a Black person, or but I didn't think of it in terms of, like, maybe a transgender person. Like, what if you want to have a story from that perspective, or you have to really think about that. And
Mm-hmm.
you make a good point there. about how you would go about that.
Hmm.
But you, so you did a lot of research, obviously, on Jesse James and on his wife and all of that. And how much time did that take? Had you been working on that for years or?
Years.
Yeah.
And not because it would have taken that long to sit down and start writing the book. It was just more a matter of it took me that long as I was gathering the information to have it morph into, for my own curiosity, to have it morph into, you know what, I think this could be, I think I started out as this could be a nice short story or something like that because there's so little about her. Um, and then as I started looking into it and thinking about it more and more, no, I think this could be a novel. I think there's enough material here to be a novel. And then I started getting serious about doing it. But yeah, years overall, years.
It's interesting too that your other books, you have more books that are set in modern times.
Mhm.
And have do you have any other books that you would want to write that are more like I Am Mrs. Jesse James or?
Well, actually, I really, really love historical fiction. I did a the 3-book romance series. That's contemporary, and I did that because those were 3 other NaNoWriMo projects that I had done, and I, was like, you know what, I did this. I'm not going to just throw it away. I might as well just go ahead and work this in, and plus I had formed my own imprint, which gave me some. It was really been a huge learning experience for me to do the process from beginning to end, as far as how do you produce, how do you, I know how to write a book, but how do you produce the book? Because that's a whole nother ball game. So that was very interesting for me. So anyway, I got that done. But my intent for my next book is I like writing about women from Missouri, which is the state that I'm from. And I have decided who the next person's going to be. I'm not telling anyone yet who it is, but that will be the next one that I work on. That'll start. I've done a lot of the reading on it already, but that will really get launched in earnest as far as putting it together in 2021.
Oh, that's awesome.
But yeah, I love historical fiction. I love to read it. I love research. Research is, unfortunately, you can fall into many rabbit holes when you're doing research because there's so much interesting stuff you uncover. Um, but I do love it. I love history. I love historical fiction.
So now, going back a little bit in your life, what did you major in college? Like, did you have in mind that you might want to be a writer, or that kind of came later?
When I was in college, well, actually, even before I started college, my goal was to be a juvenile officer. I wanted to work with kids who have problems. And so my major was in sociology, but I did have a lot of hours in psychology as well. But no, I didn't even think about
Huh.
doing any serious writing when I was in college other than research papers for classes.
That's
Um,
a good thing. That probably informed your writing
yeah,
great.
well, I spent decades as a juvenile officer, which was, I mean, there's a lot of stories there. There's a lot of ideas for stories there. And then the last 4 years I was with the juvenile office, I was their grant manager. And that meant I was writing grants and monitoring grants. So then once again, that little, gosh, that little taste of, I kind of like doing this, brought me back to, I'm going to start getting some stuff out there. And I started sending out things to Chicken Soup and other places like that. And again, they buy something and oh boy, there's no greater incentive when they say, you know what, we've accepted your story, and you're like, oh cool, I'm going to write another one. That's a awesome incentive when you have something, a company validate you by saying that they want to publish your work.
Yeah. I was wondering when you set about writing something, if you sort of like have a goal if you ever have a goal in mind of how you want a message you want to get across or how you want to affect the people who read it.
I think most books have a theme, and you may not even consciously say this is what the theme of the book is going to be. It just kind of emerges as you go along. or that's been my experience anyway. Because I think the story has to come first. If the story isn't there and it doesn't entertain people, then there's not going to be a theme. Or if there is, whatever you wanted the theme to be is not, people are just going to shut the book. The story is what comes first. And then if there's a theme, that's going to emerge as the story is told or written, I should say.
Yeah. Do you get what kind of feedback do you get from your readers? You must get.
Yeah, I've gotten a lot of feedback, primarily with the first novel, just because people are so fascinated by this family. And that was something that surprised me. I mean, they lived, Jesse James operated 130 plus years ago.
Yeah.
And for people now, you can ask a teenager now, do you know who Jesse James is? They all know. Jesse James is particularly popular over in England, believe it or not. I don't know why, but he is. So I've, connected with people across the pond as a result. People have contact, some of it's been kind of bizarre contacts. Like I've had people contact me and ask whether I think Jesse James really died or whether he faked his own death. And so he could move on and have a new life somewhere else, which no, I don't believe that.
They probably write another book.
Yeah. Well, and there are imposters that after his death claim to be Jesse James. So, and I think a lot of people like to believe that. And I always use an example. There are people who didn't want to believe Elvis Presley died, but yeah, I think he did. So, but people will believe what they want to believe. That's for darn sure.
Yeah. Well, I understand you have a book, sort of like with a holiday theme out right now. It's really like a good present for gifting or just good reading, good fare for the year.
That's Let Your Heart Be Light. That's a collection of Christmas themed stories. There's short stories in there. And there are some creative personal essays, family stories that my family's big on Christmas and always has been. I'm a huge Christmas person. It's my absolute favorite season of the year. So I thought, as the very first book I published under my own imprint, I'm going to do something I really have fun with, because who knows how it'll turn out. But it's been very well received and seems to sell pretty well. And people, most important, people seem to really enjoy it. And these are typically your traditionalist people who love the old classic movies. I did, some essays on a few of those kinds of things. And like, for example, the movie, the song Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas that was in Meet Me in St. Louis, which is a movie I love. The controversy over the lyrics in that song, which I knew nothing about until I started looking into it.
Wait, what controversy?
Yeah, I don't know about that either.
Well, now his name escapes me now, but the man who wrote the song and the lyrics, they were written very, very dark. I mean, incredibly dark. So dark that when Judy Garland was given the lyrics, and the melody, of course, is beautiful, was given the lyrics, she said, "You're going to have to change these lyrics. If I sing something like that to my little, in the scene, she's singing to her little sister who's sobbing over the fact they're going to move to New York. She says, if I sing these things to my little sister, people are going to think I'm a monster." It was things like doom and gloom, and we're going to leave our friends and we'll never see them again. And it was just horrible. So they changed the lyrics because of what Judy said. And it's still a really kind of a bittersweet, very sentimental, kind of sad song, but not to the extent that it was before. But anyway, I write about little things like that I find interesting about movies that I love, or about the classic Christmas music, which for me, Bing Crosby is the only person who should be allowed to sing White Christmas, because that's the way it should be. That's nobody else. I hear anyone else singing it, and it's like, that's not right. That's just not right. But I'm a traditionalist.
Also, I noticed that you've got this great children's book about Midnight the cat,
Mhm.
and I came across some. It seems like it started a thing where people are videotaping kids reading it and adults reading it to kids. I thought that was a neat thing. Do you have any other children's books, or is that your only
That
one?
is the only children's book, and I that was co-written with an author friend, um, and it was fun to do. I mean, she asked me, she had wanted to do this, and she contacted me and said, "Would you be willing to do it with me?" Because she doesn't really do much fiction or that kind of thing. So I was like, "Sure, that sounds interesting." And it was an interesting process. Um, and I think the illustrations are gorgeous, and it turned out very, very. I think it turned out very well. Is it something that I would see myself doing again? No, I just really don't see myself as a children's author. Um, I but it was fun to do, and kids seemed to like it. You know, have a little grandson who at the time that book came out was, gosh, I guess 2 years old, and he loved looking at the pictures, and I took some just beautiful, well, for me, very adorable pictures of him with this book in front of him, Midnight the One-Eyed Cat, just looking at those pictures. He really liked it. And that's great. He is what we all want our kids to be, which is a reader. He loves books. He's read books 2, 3, sometimes 4 every night before he goes to bed, even now, and he's 4 years old.
Oh
Uh,
my god.
he loves books, and I think that's what's going to make him into, or I hope, into a reader. And exposing kids to books is really important.
Yeah, especially with messages like that one, about,
Hmm. Yeah.
um, so, huh. Have you thought about doing any, since you worked in the juvenile, correctional field, have you ever thought about doing like the writing for young adults, what are they, kind of
Yeah,
books?
young adult fiction. Um, you know, eh, not really. Although I would say that a lot of young adult fiction, it crosses over. There's probably as many adults that have read Harry Potter as kids, as younger kids, and that's really more middle school, as opposed to young adult. So I think that there is spillover. There are adults who read young adult, and my books, especially, well, any of them really, there's no reason a young adult couldn't read any of those books. There's nothing that would stop them from doing it. Now, I don't write Twilight type stuff. I don't write, the fantasy or the vampires and all of that stuff. But a lot of people are really into that. It's all in sticking with, I think, what you feel comfortable with and what you enjoy yourself. And so I don't really see myself purposely going in to write more children's books or any young adult, but I don't think I write anything that a young adult couldn't easily read.
Yeah, I just wondered if some of your work didn't ever kind of stick in your mind, and you say, "Oh, I want to write a book and base it on that story."
Hmm.
Or
Well, I did put a character actually in my first book of my romance series that is a young man who's making wrong choices and getting himself into some trouble. So I did have a secondary character in that book that I kind of, you know, used a little bit of of my experience with as a juvenile officer when I created that character.
interesting. So your next book, you were saying, is going to be the one that's the secret topic, of another historical fiction.
Yes.
That
Yes, it'll be another historical fiction, another woman from Missouri, um, who I think had a very interesting life, and I think for a long time was forgotten by a lot of people. And I think she's not as forgotten anymore, but I think also people don't know all the breadth of things that she did during her lifetime, other than just the one thing that she's really, really famous, that she's fairly famous for, especially among people who collect a certain item. And so I won't tell any more than that, though.
more that's I got to keep it under wraps, right? I bet a lot of people are excited to hear about what the When will we find out? I guess do you wait until you've got it written or mostly written?
I usually don't say anything about my critique group knows, but they're the only ones that do. So I want it to be pretty close to at least a first draft before I, saying too much about it, because there have been books written about her. It all relates to something other than like her entire life type thing.
Actually, I think that's to jump in again. I think that's a huge point, and not to tell the story before you write the story. So many new writers, they just start talking about it, and I'm like, you can't. I will tell them, you please stop doing that, because all the energy that you would be using to write the story is used up telling the story, and all the criticism, good and bad,
Mhm.
is used up. And so within a couple of weeks, all the inspiration's gone because you've put it out there already. So I think it's really smart to just hold your cards close that way.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then on top of that, if there aren't if there aren't many books out there, or any books out there about a specific character that you've honed or person that you've honed in on and decided, this is who I really want to write about, all of a sudden, if you put it out there, there are other people who might decide, you know what, I'm going to beat you to the punch and write this person's story myself.
That's
So
true.
a little bit of selfishness there, but
Well, it's got to guard your idea there, your intellectual property. But well, so you must really trust the people in your writing group. It's
Mhm.
not people, I assume. You take an oath like something.
Yeah.
Really
What goes on in our group stays in our group.
important thing for a writer to have a community like that.
You have to trust the people that you're telling things to, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I had one question to go back to Jesse James. Pat, is what if you could change one thing about the novel right now? What would it be?
Hmm. I've been over it so many times. I don't know. Nothing, I can't say that anything necessarily leaps into my mind except for a general thing, and it would be true of all my stuff, not just the Jesse James stuff. I can't look at anything I've written, even after it's published and gone over a million times by a million different editors and whatever. I can't look at anything without seeing something. I feel like, oh, I could have done that better. I could have rearranged that better. I, um, I think it's a self-doubt thing, I guess, to some degree, or just the you want it to be as good as it can be. And so I tend to read things, and it can be a chicken soup story, it can be anything. And I'll look at it and say, oh, I could have tweaked this a little bit to make that better. I'm that way with everything. So everything I write, there's something that I feel like I
All
could
right, so then an opposite question. What did you do perfectly?
have. Well, I don't. I think I think the answer would be I don't think that I do anything perfectly. That's why everything I read, I look at and go, I could tweak that and make it better. But usually it's tweaks. Usually it's not a big, main, humongous thing in most cases. Um, I'll look at something and go, I could have made that a little more upbeat, or I look at something and say, maybe I could have introduced a little more emotion there. So, it's not a specific thing. It's more of an in general desire to tweak something to death. I have a bad problem with that.
You know, how would you introduce a little more emotion somewhere? You would just in through the dialogue, or that's an interesting.
It could be through dialogue, through action, just or through, just the things that are unsaid, um, that are just implied, and you let the reader come to the conclusion. Um, there are different little tricks, I guess, for lack of a better term. Tricks is probably not the best word, but um, it goes back to the author's mantra, show, don't tell, show, don't tell. Maybe I told too much instead of doing the more subtle. I have this posted on my bulletin board right now, and it's a quote from Anton Chekhov, who's one of my very favorite writing quotes. Don't tell me the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass. I mean, to me, that sums it up. Sometimes I think I'm a little too heavy-handed with things. Um, but it's harder to be subtle. That's for sure. It's harder to be subtle than it is to just put it out there.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, because it's, and I love that quote. I may have to steal that and put that
Oh,
on my bulletin board as well, because it's something that I'm constantly doing with writers. If I have the opportunity to edit their material, is how do you? Let me rephrase that. Being conscious of all the opportunities that you have to write to someone's imagination.
Mhm.
Telling is just writing to somebody's intellect, but showing is writing to somebody's imagination,
Mhm.
and that is the glint of light on the broken window. um yeah, you've got me.
inspired.
And that actually brings up another question I've got, about your relationship with your editor. I know you work closely with Christy, but that takes a whole lot of trust, I would think. What doesn't it?
It does. But one thing I will say, are you hearing me?
I am.
Okay. It sounded a little different in my headphone. Um, I think, yeah, it does. You want to work with an editor you trust. Absolutely. Now, all of my stuff, including this, before it went anywhere, before like this book went to Christy, it went to an editor I use in Florida. And and through my critique group as well, because they will also put their comments on things, and through a beta reader who will also put their comments on things. And the way I look at the editor relationship now, granted, in some cases, in the case where it's the editor is part of the publishing company, their word is going to be pretty much final on what happens. But generally, she would say, this is what I think, and then kind of leave it up to me whether I wanted to follow it or not, which is the same with my uh, person that I work with in Florida, and the person that my critique group and my beta readers. You get all the feedback, and then you have to look at it and decide. Um, this is what I'm going to do. I'm hearing all of this. I'm either going to make some changes, which in most cases I do. I make some changes based on the feedback I get. On rare occasions, it's like, no, this particular thing I don't want to change because that's the way I meant it to be. The way it's interpreted is the way I meant it to be. Um, but generally speaking, I always listen to the feedback, and generally speaking, at least some of it, probably the most of it, I will incorporate in some way, shape, or form.
And I'm nodding my head. I think Mary is too. It's
Yeah.
it's it's how it reminds me of just another question I had when I've gone through the murder boards of the writing groups, where they offer their comments meant to be constructive, but by the end of it you feel rather uh, 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 depleted's the word that comes to mind.
Mhm.
And I remember leaving one of those workshops asking a friend of mine, it's like, I don't know what to do with all of this. I had everything from I really enjoyed this to this is horrible trash. Why are you even bringing it to this group? I mean, it was that bad. And over the years of going through writers groups, um, actually, let me rephrase this because I want to turn this into a question. How do you sift through? Uh, how do you find constructive criticism in all of that feedback? How do you know something's constructive, and how do you know when it's not?
Well, first of all, I think you have to have trusted people, and it was something we talked about earlier. If you trust, the people that you're working with, it makes a huge difference, because there's a difference between, somebody who's giving you constructive feedback and someone who's just being negative and maybe not so helpful for whatever reasons. So it has to be somebody you trust. Um, and and as far as sifting through it, I'll read through, for example, in my critique group, I might have feedback on a sentence from 10 different people, and there might be 10 different opinions. Um, One thing that'll make me really take a close look is if, let's say, 4 or 5 people are saying the same thing. It's like that is a strong indication that something I really need to look at. If one person points it out, I'll read it and read what they have to say, and then make a decision on I like it the way I did it better, and I'll leave it that way. Or I might look at what that one person's picked up on and say, of course, that makes perfect sense, and make the change. So it really just has to be a trusted person, and then you just have to go over it and then go with your gut as far as what you think is going to be the best thing for your story, because in the final analysis, it is your story that you're telling.
So it's very
Like,
much a learning process then, as you go through with your group and your trusted people. Definitely, they have your best interest at heart, but ultimately you have to make the choice yourself. But maybe that might inform you in the future when you're writing something. You might think, oh, well, I didn't, what they said about this time, I
mhm.
didn't take that, but then maybe would it inform you in the future when you're writing something else, maybe?
Yeah, it's sure possible. Yeah, it's possible, because you tend to file all those little nuggets away,
Yeah.
uh, and bring it out for future reference.
About how many people are in your group? Is it small?
When everyone is there, which is not very often, usually, especially now, the group is we did Zoom for a long time. And then as people felt more comfortable meeting again, um, we resumed our in-person meetings, everyone wearing their mask, of course. Um, when everyone is there, it'd be about 12 people.
That's what I was
So,
picturing.
and which is really can be a lot, because if some people tend to be more long-winded than others. Our process, every group's process is different. Our process is we send the material out in advance, and then as we meet, we go over, the person who brought the piece reads it out loud, and the rest of the group is marking on their, because they each have a copy, so they're all marking on their papers as you read. And then we go around the room, and people give their critique of your piece. And usually we don't allow more than 5 pages, otherwise we'd be there forever. Uh, and sometimes we actually have to limit with that many people to like 2 or 3 minutes or up to 5 minutes of comments, before we go on to the next, or we'll run out of time. So that's kind of what our process is. So it's about 12 people, which that's much more than that, and it's just not very manageable to get together and meet. Um, Even though, like I said, it's rare, because somebody will have a doctor's appointment or whatever. So it's usually probably more like eight people or so that actually are there for each meeting.
So interesting. The fact that you would all be talking about one sentence at a time, how does that happen? Do you just say, oh, well, someone says, let's talk about this, and then other people say, yeah, I have something to say about that sentence?
Well, somebody might say, that took me out of the story. That sentence took me out of the story, or whatever reason that they give. And then the next person might say, oh, I disagree. Because you won't even get perfect agreement amongst everybody in the group, because writing is very subjective. It's, you can enter a contest, and one judge will award it, uh, will not award it anything. And that same piece, another judge looks at and gives it first place. It's totally subjective, which I judged. I was a judge last year for Western Writers of America for their short story division. And I had so many stories to read, but I remember thinking, oh my gosh, this is really difficult. How do you pick the top 3 of 100 short stories? Of course, some were easy. It was easy for me to say no. But interestingly, there's 3 judges for each category, and the 3 that I picked were 2 of the 3 that I picked went on to take first, second, or third. So that meant that the other 2 were looking at things the same way I was, which I thought was really interesting. But I mean, I got off track there a little bit, but really writing is such a subjective thing. It all depends on who's reading it, what
Yeah.
they think of your story. One person loves it, another person doesn't, which is why there's room for a lot of writers and a lot of different genres and a lot of different writing styles, because you will find your readership.
Right. Yeah, that is interesting though that you that must have been reassuring when you realized out of all those stories you came
Mhm.
up with, you chose that other people.
Yeah, I was very surprised too, because it was like, I'm probably way out in left field with what I'm picking here, but apparently the other 2 were on the same page with me.
That's really cool. Well, this has been so interesting. It's been really great talking with you.
Yeah, it's been fun. It's been fun to talk for sure about
Yeah.
one of my favorite topics too.
Yeah, sure. And Lisa's too. I'm gonna have to. I'm just gonna be waiting with until this next book comes out to see who it's about, and I can't wait to read it. I'll have to maybe check in again with you, and when it gets close to being published.
I like that idea actually, because you've given us a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Here's a few clues. Missouri woman who collects things. So what? I'm going to have to look through that.
So I figure it out. Keep it under wraps. I know.
Well, she's a creator more than well, she was a collector too. She was both.
Yeah, I know. I've got the same feeling. It's like, I'm gonna have to think about this for a bit.
Well, you being from Missouri, Lisa, you have an advantage there. Maybe it'll come to you, but I don't know. I'm like Pat. I don't want anybody to find out and try to steal the idea. They won't do it as well as Pat, so have to let her have time to write her book.
That is true. That is true. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm really glad that you shared all this stuff. I think it's got nice nuggets for experienced writers and good pieces of advice for writers just starting out. So that's really good. I'm going to repeat myself. Really good stuff to have hear from an experienced writer and somebody that continues to write.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you. I had a great time. I thought it was a lot of fun, and I mentioned our Saturday Writers group before, and writers encouraging writers is the tagline for our group, and I think that's what it's all about. That's why you connect with other writers, because it does help you in learning the craft and in doing the craft.
Yeah, you seem like you would make a terrific mentor for anyone of any age that wanted to write.
Well,
So
thanks. I hope so,
nice to
because
see that.
I've had plenty of mentors.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll call things to a close. And again, I want to thank you, Pat and Lisa, for joining us today. This has been a great conversation, and we'll leave it open. We'll have to come back and talk some more about.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks so much.
All right.
Bye.
See you later.